Tokyo, February 1945. Before dawn, the city sleeps beneath a thin winter haze. From the windows of an underground command post, a faint glow of maps and cigarette smoke hangs in the air. Inside, Japanese officers huddle over a large wall chart. Red circles mark bomber ranges. Blue lines trace the paths of approaching raids. A young pilot, his uniform still smelling of aviation fuel, stares silently at a new set of markings drawn in American pencil. They stretch far, too far, from the Marianas across the endless Pacific, all the way to the heart of Tokyo. He follows the arc with his finger, disbelief tightening his throat. These were not the stubby P-40s or short-legged Thunderbolts he once knew. These were new machines, long-range, relentless. The P-51D Mustang. Outside, the air raid sirens remain silent, but every man in the room feels the same invisible pressure. Distance, Japan's oldest defense, has vanished overnight, for the first time. Tokyo was within reach of the enemy's wings. For most of the Pacific War, Japan's greatest shield had not been steel or soldiers. It was geography. Thousands of miles of open ocean stretched between the Japanese home islands and any major Allied base. American bombers operating from China or the small islands of the Central Pacific were restricted by distance, weather, and fuel. The Imperial Japanese Army Air Force, though strained, believed the homeland was untouchable. In 1942 and 1943, the Doolittle raid had been dismissed as a symbolic gesture. Daring, yes, but impossible to repeat on a scale that could threaten Japan's industrial core. The skies over Tokyo remained, for a time, quiet and sovereign. But as 1944 began, the map of the Pacific was being redrawn. The relentless island-hopping campaigns of the U.S. Marines and Navy brought the Allies steadily closer. Tarawa, Saipan, Tinian, Guam. Each captured island became a forward base, each base a new springboard toward Japan. The strategic purpose was clear. From the Marianas, the Americans could finally bring their most formidable weapon to bear, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. With its pressurized cabin, remote-controlled turrets, and enormous range, the B-29 was designed for one target above all others, the Japanese mainland. By late 1944, these gleaming bombers were massing on runways carved from coral in the Central Pacific. To the Japanese, it seemed impossible that aircraft could fly more than 3,000 kilometers, drop tons of bombs, and return safely. And yet, reports began to arrive. Formations of silver aircraft crossing the night sky, radar screens lighting up with signals from the south. At first, Japanese commanders hoped the B-29s could be intercepted before reaching the cities. Fighter squadrons were scrambled, but their aging aircraft, the Ki-43 Oscar, the Ki-44 Tojo, and the Ki-61 Tony, struggled to reach the bombers at 30,000 feet. The few that did found themselves outnumbered and outgunned. Still, one faint hope remained. Even the mighty B-29 needed escorts. Without long-range fighter protection, American bombers were vulnerable, just as they had been over Germany before the arrival of the P-51 Mustang. Japanese strategists clung to that belief. They calculated that the US must eventually halt its raids or suffer unsustainable losses. If Japan could endure, if it could defend its homeland long enough, perhaps the Americans would negotiate. But inside intelligence circles, the truth was beginning to surface. Prisoner interrogations, reconnaissance photos, and intercepted communications hinted at something ominous. A new Allied fighter with a range no one thought possible. The Japanese Army Air Force had already heard rumors from Europe. German officers spoke of an American aircraft that could escort bombers from England to Berlin and back, a plane with unmatched speed, altitude, and endurance. Its name surfaced again and again in intelligence summaries. P-51 Mustang. When the first reports came from the Pacific, sightings of fast, low-flying fighters painted with silver fuselages and blue noses, few in Tokyo believed them. Engineers insisted it was a mistake. The Mustang was a European aircraft. It couldn't possibly operate over the vast Pacific. But by December 1944, those denials began to crumble. American supply convoys were unloading crates of new fighters on Saipan and Iwo Jima. The US Army Air Forces had done the unthinkable. They had modified, tested, and prepared the Mustang for oceanic warfare, and soon, the red circles on Japanese maps, the range of American aircraft, began to expand. Line by line, the safe zone around the home islands shrank. The illusion of distance, Japan's most trusted ally, was dying. And as the new year dawned, Japan's pilots would finally see the weapon that would make their skies a battlefield. When the Americans first introduced the P-51 Mustang in Europe, it was already reshaping the air war. Born from British necessity and American industry, the aircraft's origins were unconventional. In 1940, The British Purchasing Commission had requested a fast, agile fighter to supplement their aging Spitfires and Hurricanes. What North American aviation produced, almost overnight, was the NA-73, an aircraft that combined elegance, economy, and extraordinary range. At first, its Allison engine limited high-altitude performance. But when the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine was fitted, everything changed. Suddenly, the Mustang could cruise faster, climb higher, and fly farther than any piston fighter before it. The Packard Company in the US built the Merlin under license, and by 1944, the definitive P-51D variant was rolling off production lines in thousands. In Europe, it escorted bombers from England deep into Germany, forcing the Luftwaffe into open battle. By late 1944, German fighter losses were catastrophic. The lesson was clear. When the bombers were protected by Mustangs, they could reach any target, Berlin, Dresden, Munich, and return home. American strategists looked to the Pacific and saw the same opportunity. The challenge was distance. The Pacific Ocean stretched wider than all of Europe, and Japan lay far beyond the reach of any existing Allied fighter. To strike Tokyo, bombers would need to fly from the newly captured Marianas, nearly 1,500 miles away. No single-engine fighter could escort them that far. None, until the P-51D engineers and tacticians went to work. Long-range external drop tanks, first tested in Europe, were optimized for Pacific conditions. Fuel management techniques were refined. Cruise climb, lean mixture, precise throttle discipline. The result was astonishing. The Mustang's combat radius now exceeded 1,600 miles. It meant one thing. A fighter could take off from Iwo Jima or Saipan, climb with the bombers, escort them to Tokyo, fight over the city, and return. The Pacific had been crossed by steel and fuel. In January 1945, the first P-51D units began arriving in the Marianas and on recently secured Iwo Jima airstrips. Pilots of the 15th and 21st Fighter Groups, veterans of the European theater, now prepared for a different kind of war, one fought over ocean, cloud, and volcanic rock. Their mission was clear: protect the B-29 superfortresses as they struck Japan. But the Mustang's presence carried a deeper purpose. It was a message that no corner of Japan's empire, not even the capital, could remain untouched. Meanwhile, Japanese Air Defense Command, under General Masakazu Kawabe, began receiving alarming intelligence. Radar operators on the coast of Kyushu reported new, faster aircraft moving ahead of incoming bomber streams. Pilots returning from interception missions described sleek, silver fighters diving with tremendous speed, then climbing away untouched. At first, commanders assumed these were Lockheed Lightnings or Corsairs operating from carriers. But their persistence, their reach, and their precision soon disproved that theory. These were something else, something entirely new. By February, photographs recovered from downed aircraft confirmed the truth. The long wings, the distinct bubble canopy, the twin underwing drop tanks, unmistakable. The P-51D Mustang had arrived in the Pacific. For Japanese pilots, the shock was immediate. Their air defense plans had been built around the belief that bombers, unescorted, could be isolated and destroyed. But the Mustang changed that equation overnight. Now, any attack on a bomber formation meant facing an escort capable of matching and surpassing Japan's best interceptors. The Mustang's range map, once theoretical, was now a nightmare in ink and radius lines. The arcs reached across the Pacific like grasping hands. From Iwo Jima, they touched Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka. In the operations rooms beneath Tokyo's defense ministry, the realization spread quietly, grimly. The enemy's reach had become limitless, and soon, Japanese pilots would face the Mustang not as a rumor, but as a silver silhouette in the morning sky. The first time Japanese pilots saw the P-51D Mustang in combat, they didn't recognize it. It was late February 1945. The sun was rising over the Pacific, painting the B-29 formations in a faint silver glow as they approached the Japanese mainland. From bases in Honshu, interceptor squadrons scrambled to meet them. Kai-84, Franks, Kai-61 Tonys, and a handful of Kai-100 prototypes. They climbed as they always had, expecting the bomber stream to be unguarded once it crossed the long stretch of ocean. But this time things were different. As the fighters reached altitude, they saw specks far ahead, smaller, faster, closing quickly. Within moments, the sky erupted. Sleek, silver aircraft slashed through the formation with impossible speed. Their wingtips gleamed in the sun, the blue-painted noses flashing like knives in the light. Then the tracers came, disciplined, precise, deadly. Lieutenant Kuroda of the 244th Sentai would later recall. They appeared out of the sun. One moment we were climbing to meet the bombers. The next, we were being hunted. The Mustang's pilots, many of them veterans from the European front, brought with them a new style of air combat: calculated aggression. They knew how to climb high, strike fast, and use the Mustang's power to disengage before the enemy could react. To the Japanese, who had relied on agility and close-in turning fights, it was a shock. The Ki-43 and Ki-44, once nimble and dominant, found themselves overmatched in speed, firepower, and endurance. A single burst from the Mustang's 650 caliber machine guns could rip through aluminum and fuel tanks, leaving nothing but smoke and falling debris. For the Japanese pilots, every interception became an act of courage against the inevitable. They took off knowing the odds, some whispering quiet farewells before climbing into the cold blue. In briefing rooms across Japan, morale began to erode. Reports came in daily. Fighters lost before reaching the bombers, pilots missing over the ocean, squadrons decimated before they could even engage. The Mustang was no longer a rumor. It was the hunter in the sky. The technological angle, engineering, that changed the war. To understand why the Mustang terrified Japan's airmen, one must understand its genius. The P-51D wasn't merely fast. It was efficient. Its laminar flow wing, designed by NACA engineers, reduced drag and increased range dramatically. It sliced through the air with minimal resistance, allowing it to cruise long distances without guzzling fuel. Combined with two 75-gallon drop tanks, it could fly farther than any single-engine fighter ever had. Its engine, the Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin VI 1657, gave it unmatched high-altitude performance. While Japanese fighters gasped for power above 25,000 feet, the Mustang thrived there, escorting the B-29s through the thin, freezing air over the Pacific. But the Mustang's brilliance wasn't just mechanical. It was designed for the pilot. The cockpit was clear and spacious, its visibility nearly panoramic thanks to the new bubble canopy. Controls were light and responsive, the instrument panel logically arranged for combat efficiency. It was a machine that turned pilots into tacticians. They didn't have to fight the plane. They could think, maneuver, and dominate the airspace. Meanwhile, Japanese engineers were trapped in the opposite direction. Their factories were under constant bombardment, their aluminum supplies dwindling, their fuel reserves nearly gone. They still relied on older airframes, lightweight, maneuverable, but fragile. Their engines lacked turbochargers and high-octane fuel. Every technological advantage tilted toward the Americans. In the air, the difference was visible. The Mustang could dive past 500 miles per hour without structural failure. Japanese fighters, designed for agility rather than strength, often tore themselves apart trying to follow. Radar coordination and radio communication amplified this edge even further. American pilots flew as teams, guided by ground controllers and air-to-air radio chatter. Japanese pilots often flew alone, dependent on eyesight and instinct. The result was devastating. For every Mustang lost, several Japanese interceptors vanished in flame. To Japan's air staff, the implications were chilling. The Mustang was not just a fighter. It was a symbol of what industrial might, engineering, and logistics could achieve when combined with tactical mastery. It represented everything Japan could no longer match: fuel, factories, precision, and training. By early March 1945, the High Command understood the truth. Their pilots were brave. But bravery alone no longer equaled survival, and as the P-51 squadrons grew in number, their presence would transform the air war into something Japan had never faced before: total domination from the sky. But while technology decided the battle's shape, the tactics of its use would determine how quickly Japan's defenses would crumble. By March 1945, the U.S. Army Air Forces had refined a new art, the art of air dominance by escort. It was not enough to send bombers to targets. The bombers had to arrive, strike, and return. The P-51D Mustang made that possible, not just through range, but through tactics. Each escort mission was a ballet of precision. The Mustang groups would take off first, circling the airfields of Iwo Jima or Saipan, climbing to their rendezvous altitude. Below them, streams of B-29 superfortresses roared toward formation. Then, the two forces would merge, an enormous silver procession heading northwest over the endless Pacific. Every pilot knew the sequence. Mustangs flew cover at 3 levels: high-altitude top cover, mid-altitude bomber weave, and low cleanup patrols. As the formation neared Japan, the escorts fanned out like a living shield. Japanese interceptors would appear, first as dots on the horizon, then as streaks diving from the sun. But this time, they met not defenseless bombers, but alert fighters already waiting for them. American pilots had studied interception patterns for months. They knew how the Japanese would approach: high-speed dives followed by steep climbs to escape. So they built counter-maneuvers: thatch weaves, slashing dives, and scissors turns. They fought in pairs and groups, covering one another with overlapping fields of fire. For Japanese pilots used to one-on-one duels, the coordination was bewildering. The Mustangs didn't fight for glory or individual kills. They fought to protect the mission. Every time a Japanese aircraft closed on a bomber, a Mustang appeared in its path. Every attack ended in a trap. The result was swift and merciless. By April, interception losses for Japan reached catastrophic levels. On several raids, more than half of the defending fighters failed to return. The skies above Tokyo became a graveyard of falling aluminum and fire. In debriefings, American pilots described the air battles as hunting, not fighting. They no longer feared interception. They welcomed it. The Mustang's dominance was now absolute. Its presence turned every Japanese defense into a massacre. But the real weapon wasn't just the Mustang's guns. It was what the aircraft represented: coordination, endurance, and planning. A machine and a method that no empire could stop. The psychological angle, the death of the sky spirit. The Japanese concept of kokutai, or national spirit, extended into the air. Pilots were taught that skill, courage, and sacrifice could overcome material odds. This belief had carried them through the early years of the war, through the lightning victories of 1941 and the kamikaze attacks of 1944. But now, in 1945, that spirit was being tested by something it couldn't defeat. Inevitability. From Tokyo's command centers to the airfields of Kyushu. A quiet despair spread. Reports from pilots returning from combat told the same story. The Americans had taken the sky. The Mustang's range and speed meant there was nowhere left to hide. Even the flight to intercept was demoralizing. Pilots climbed for nearly an hour just to reach altitude, burning precious fuel, knowing that by the time they arrived, Mustangs were already overhead. Many never saw the bombers. They were destroyed by escorts miles from the target. For those who did survive, the emotional toll was immense. Missions ended with empty briefings, empty chairs, and silence. Aircraft returned riddled with holes, engines barely holding together. Some pilots landed, stepped out of their cockpits, and collapsed beside their planes. Not from wounds, but from exhaustion and hopelessness. American psychological warfare analysts later noted that the effect of the Mustang was greater than bombing alone. It was a weapon of fear. The sight of silver fighters circling above every formation told Japan's airmen that resistance was futile. The contrast was staggering. In American bases on Iwo Jima, pilots ate hot meals, flew reliable aircraft, and returned to laughter and camaraderie. In Japan, pilots often flew from grass strips, short on fuel and ammunition, under constant alert of air raids. By May 1945, Japan's veteran pilots were almost gone. Replacements, boys barely out of training, were sent up against the most skilled fighter corps on Earth. They were brave, but they were doomed. For every new Japanese pilot, there were 2, sometimes 3 Mustangs waiting. Each engagement was swift. Each loss chipped away at the belief that spirit could conquer steel. As the war dragged toward its final months, even the most loyal officers began to understand the truth. Japan's air power no longer existed as a fighting force, and it was the Mustang, the sleek, efficient messenger from across the ocean, that had delivered that truth to their skies. Soon, the psychological collapse would meet its physical reality, in the most destructive raids Japan had ever known. The morning of February the 16th, 1945, began like many others in wartime Japan. Gray clouds over Tokyo Bay, the distant hum of industry, the quiet rhythm of a nation under siege. Yet beneath that calm, the air defense network was straining. Radar operators along the southern coast had detected large formations moving steadily north from the Pacific. The alarm spread through radio networks. Enemy aircraft approaching. Likely B-29's. At Chofu Airfield, just west of Tokyo, pilots ran for their aircraft. Mechanics shouted final checks. Ground crews hauled fuel hoses from frozen drums. The Japanese 244th Sentai, among the last elite home defense units, scrambled to intercept. Within minutes, the first waves of B-29 superfortresses appeared above the haze, sunlight glinting off their wings. To the Japanese, the formation seemed endless, a moving fortress of thunder and vapor trails. But something was different. Ahead of the bombers flew smaller shapes, fast, glimmering dots that the observers couldn't identify at first. Then the radio crackled with disbelief. These are not bombers! They are fighters! For the first time, P-51D Mustangs were crossing into Japan's mainland airspace. They came in disciplined squadrons, engines roaring in perfect synchrony, escorting the massive bomber armada from the Marianas. The sky, once Japan's last refuge, was now American. As the 244th Sentai climbed to intercept, Captain Teruhiko Kobayashi led his men upward through broken clouds. His Kai-84's controls shuddered as he reached altitude. Then, From the glare of the sun, silver aircraft dived toward them with blinding speed. Gunfire flashed in the morning sky. The first pass was brutal. Tracers tore through a formation of Ki-61s before they could turn. The Mustangs rolled through the chaos, climbing steeply, reforming, striking again. The Japanese counterattack collapsed into fragments. Lieutenant Yasuda, one of the few survivors that day, would later write, "They came from every angle. You could not fight one without another behind you. The sky belonged to them." Below, the B-29s unleashed their payloads. Bombs fell across Tokyo's industrial wards. Musashino, Kawasaki, Nakajima aircraft works. Flames rose like pillars through the smoke. For hours, the sound of engines and explosions merged into a single, unbroken roar. On the ground, civilians watched in stunned silence as the air defenses failed to respond. Anti-aircraft guns fired sporadically, their shells bursting harmlessly below the bombers. The defenders were overwhelmed before the battle had even begun. By the time the bombers turned south for home, hundreds of buildings lay in ruins. The Japanese air staff, monitoring the operation from underground bunkers, listened to the combat reports with grim resignation. Their best pilots had been slaughtered, their interceptors scattered. The shock was not just physical, it was strategic, even spiritual. For years, Japan's leadership had believed that geography was armor. The Pacific's vastness had been their shield. But now, the unthinkable had occurred. American fighters had crossed that distance, fought over the capital, and returned safely. When U.S. reconnaissance photographs from the mission were analyzed, the range maps confirmed what the Japanese already feared. With Iwo Jima secured and the P-51D fully deployed, no target on the home islands was beyond reach. In Tokyo's military headquarters, officers stood around a large map table. A staff aide spread out a captured Allied chart showing the Mustang's range. Concentric circles centered on Iwo Jima, each labeled in calm, measured script. The innermost touched Tokyo itself. Silence filled the room. One general broke it softly. "We no longer have a sky." The first Mustang raids had proven it. Japan's last illusion of safety was gone. And yet, worse was coming. A firestorm that would erase entire districts and make the night sky itself burn. The P-51D had opened the door. The B-29s would walk through it. On the night of March 9th, 1945, Tokyo was about to experience the most destructive air raid in human history. American intelligence had chosen its target carefully, the heart of Japan's war production and its capital's wooden neighborhoods. General Curtis LeMay, commander of 1st Bomber Command, had changed strategy. High-altitude daylight precision raids had failed to break Japan's resistance. Now he would strike low, at night and with fire. But this time, unlike earlier raids, the B-29 superfortresses would not fly alone. Circling above the Pacific, dozens of P-51D Mustangs waited in the darkness, ready to escort the returning bombers at dawn and destroy any interceptor that dared take off. The Americans had mastered control of both day and night. Shortly after midnight, the first wave of B-29s appeared over Tokyo Bay. They flew at only 5,000 to 8,000 feet, dropping thousands of tons of incendiaries. Napalm and magnesium bombs cascaded through the cold air, striking the wooden heart of the city. Within minutes, firestorms erupted across the eastern wards, Shitamachi, Honjo, Asakusa. Eyewitnesses described it as the end of the world. Flames raced faster than men could run. Entire streets vanished in whirlwinds of heat. The air itself seemed to ignite. At the height of the inferno, the temperature reached over 1,000 degrees Celsius. The asphalt boiled. Water in the canals turned to steam. People fled toward the Sumida River, only to find it already filled with burning debris. From the air, Mustang pilots circling at high altitude watched in stunned silence. The glow of the fire was visible 150 miles away. They could see the outlines of Tokyo's streets drawn in flame. A city consumed. Below them, Japan's interceptors tried to rise. A few desperate Ki-84s took off from airfields outside the capital. But as soon as they climbed, the Mustangs were upon them. One after another, the Japanese fighters were cut down, their burning wrecks falling into the firestorm below. By dawn, the raid was over. More than 100,000 civilians were dead. 16 square miles of Tokyo lay in ashes. Over 1 million people were homeless. The Americans lost 14 bombers, a fraction compared to the scale of destruction delivered. In the aftermath, surviving Japanese air commanders gathered to assess what had happened. There was no strategy left to discuss. Their radar network had failed. Their interceptors had been powerless. Their anti-aircraft guns silenced by lack of ammunition. One colonel's report summarized the situation with chilling brevity. The defense of the empire's capital is no longer possible. Enemy aircraft possess full freedom of the skies. To the U.S. airmen, the raid was proof that air power alone could cripple a nation. The P-51D's range and the B-29's payload had combined into a single, devastating system, a weapon not just of destruction, but of dominance. In the weeks that followed, the Mustang squadrons grew in number and confidence. They roamed the skies over Japan almost unopposed, strafing airfields, railways, convoys, and factories. Even when there were no bombers to escort, the Mustangs hunted freely, turning daylight into danger for anyone who moved. Japanese civilians began referring to them simply as the Silver Plains. To see one was to know death was near. By May 1945, entire cities, Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, had been reduced to smoldering wastelands. Each time the bombers came, the Mustangs were there first, clearing the skies, sweeping away what little resistance remained. For the Japanese air staff, the psychological weight was unbearable. Their homeland, once thought unreachable, now burned nightly. The P-51D had stripped away the illusion of control, leaving only surrender or annihilation. In post-war interrogations, captured Japanese officers described that moment of realization vividly. One said, "When the Americans came with those fighters, we knew the war was over, even before the bombs." The night Tokyo burned marked not just the destruction of a city, but the final defeat of Japan's Air Force, a collapse not of courage, but of hope. And as the smoke rose over the ruins, the world entered a new age, one where distance could no longer protect any nation. When daylight finally broke over Tokyo on March 10, 1945, the rising sun revealed not the imperial capital of a mighty empire, but a charred skeleton of wood and ash. The once bustling neighborhoods of Shitamachi had been erased from existence. Mile after mile of blackened ruins, smoldering chimneys, and the twisted frames of bicycles and streetcars that no longer moved. The smell of smoke and burned flesh hung heavy in the air for days. American reconnaissance aircraft photographed the destruction in the morning light. Analysts studying the images in Guam were stunned. The city had been reduced to cinders, a devastation exceeding even the bombings of Hamburg and Dresden combined. And the most astonishing part, it had been achieved with near-total air superiority, thanks to the P-51D Mustang's range and dominance. LeMay's commanders now had what they called a clear corridor to Japan's heartland. From newly captured bases on Iwo Jima, P-51Ds could take off, meet the B-29 formations halfway, and escort them all the way to Tokyo and back. The Pacific, once a natural shield, had become a highway of destruction. In the weeks after the Tokyo firebombing, the Japanese defense network unraveled completely. Communications were shattered, radar stations destroyed or unmanned. Fighter pilots who survived the first encounters refused to take off unless directly ordered. They had seen what awaited them in the skies, an enemy that seemed untouchable. Reports from airfields around Honshu told the same story. At Chofu, out of 150 aircraft, only 23 were serviceable. At Yokota, maintenance crews cannibalized wrecks just to keep a handful flying. And still, the Mustangs came. They no longer needed large targets. Rail lines, bridges, even lone vehicles became prey. Mustang pilots flew fighter sweeps across the countryside, attacking anything that moved. One Japanese witness recalled seeing trains derailed by strafing runs and farmers diving into irrigation ditches to escape the machine gun bursts from above. By mid-April, the Japanese command could no longer deny the truth. Their air defense had ceased to exist as an organized force. Meetings at the Imperial General Headquarters turned grim and desperate. Without control of the skies, their navy could not sail, their factories could not produce, and their soldiers on the islands could not be resupplied. A classified intelligence assessment written that month concluded, "Enemy fighters possess freedom to attack anywhere within the empire." Morale of our air personnel is critically low. The situation is beyond recovery. For the United States, the aftermath was equally profound, but in a different way. The American press called it the war without front lines. And indeed, from that night forward, Japan's front lines existed only in the sky, a domain the Americans now ruled completely. But for the men who flew the missions, victory carried a darker weight. Many Mustang pilots returned from their sorties silent, shaken by what they had seen below. The sight of burning cities and rivers filled with bodies lingered in their minds long after the guns were cleaned and the fuel tanks refilled. In private letters, some confessed unease. One pilot wrote, "I know we're winning, but God help me. I can't forget what I saw down there." The destruction of Tokyo had achieved its military purpose, but it also revealed the terrible cost of that success. And yet, the campaign was not over. The Mustangs would fly again, over Osaka, Nagoya, and eventually the skies of Kyushu, until Japan itself lay prostrate. By the spring of 1945, Japan's Air Force existed largely in name only. Factories struggled to assemble even a handful of planes. Aluminum was scarce. Fuel was almost unobtainable. Young cadets were sent aloft with only a few hours of flight training, some barely able to land safely. Yet they were ordered to intercept formations guarded by veteran American pilots flying the finest fighter of the war, the P-51D Mustang. Every morning, the same grim ritual unfolded. Spotters reported the approach of B-29 formations. Airfields sounded their alarms, and pilots scrambled into aircraft that they knew stood almost no chance of returning. Many of these interceptors never reached altitude, intercepted and destroyed by Mustangs long before they could form up. To the Japanese people, the sky itself had turned into a symbol of defeat. Children in the countryside pointed upward at the silver shapes glinting in the sun and whispered, "America no Tori," the American birds. Farmers learned to hide their carts beneath trees at the sound of engines. In cities, women ran to riverbanks at the first hint of the droning bombers overhead, clutching their children and praying that their neighborhood would be spared. Even at night, the sense of vulnerability never faded. The fire raids continued with relentless precision, and when dawn broke, the P-51s returned to strike what remained. The Japanese command watched in disbelief as the Americans operated with mechanical regularity, flying mission after mission, as if the Pacific Ocean no longer existed. By July 1945, the U.S. Army Air Forces controlled the air over all of Japan. On any given day, over 1,000 aircraft could strike targets anywhere from Hokkaido to Kyushu. Entire wings of Mustangs now operated directly from Iwo Jima, cutting hours off their flight time. Air superiority had become absolute. It was not merely a strategic victory. It was psychological domination. Captured Japanese diaries from the period speak of the silence of surrender that settled over their homeland. Pilots wrote of their frustration, unable to fight back against an enemy that could appear at will. One officer's entry read simply, "We have lost the sky. Without the sky, the land is meaningless." Meanwhile, in Washington and on Guam, planners were already discussing the next stage. Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan itself. The P-51D would be the spearhead of that assault, protecting landing craft and pulverizing any remaining resistance. But before that invasion could begin, something even more decisive would happen. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. When the mushroom clouds rose in August, the P-51s were still flying overhead, ensuring that no Japanese aircraft interfered with the bombers. The world had entered the atomic age. Yet even in that new era, it was the Mustang that symbolized the end of Japan's air war. After the surrender on September 2nd, 1945, American pilots flew reconnaissance missions over the defeated nation. They saw airfields littered with wrecked aircraft, fuel drums rusting in the rain, and hangars turned into makeshift shelters for refugees. Japan's once proud aviation industry, the creators of the Zero, lay in ruins. In post-war reports, American analysts noted that the Mustang's impact went far beyond its technical excellence. It had changed the tempo of the war, proving that reach and persistence mattered as much as speed or firepower. It had shown that no fortress, no island, and no capital was beyond the reach of modern air power. General LeMay himself would later write, "The P-51 made the B-29 effective. Without it, the bombing campaign could not have been sustained." For the Japanese, the lesson was far more painful. Their strategy had been built on the idea of distance, that the Pacific's vastness would shield them. The Mustang destroyed that illusion completely. As peace returned, the same pilots who had once flown through the firestorms now escorted food drops and relief missions. They flew low over ruined cities, their engines no longer symbols of fear, but of an approaching end to hunger and ruin. In those quiet flights, the war's most destructive weapon became, for a brief moment, an instrument of mercy, and beneath their wings, Japan began to rebuild, from ashes into a nation forever changed by the sound of those engines. In the end, the story of the P-51D Mustang over Japan is not only about engineering or strategy, it is about the shattering of a belief. For centuries, Japan had been defined by its isolation. The sea was its armor, its distance a wall. Even when war reached across oceans, that faith in separation endured. But in 1945, a silver-winged machine erased that comfort in a single sweep of its propeller. The Mustang proved that no land was unreachable. It turned geography into illusion. Its long-range tanks, sleek frame, and patient endurance made it the most decisive messenger of a new age. One where oceans could no longer protect. And no empire could hide behind maps. Yet, there was another truth beneath its power. For every victory it brought, it also carried a shadow. The recognition that domination from the air could destroy not just armies, but entire cities, entire ways of life. The fire that consumed Tokyo burned away more than buildings. It consumed the idea that war could ever again be contained. In the calm after the surrender, as Japan's ruins cooled and children played in the wreckage, American pilots began to understand what their machines had truly done. The Mustang had not only won a war, it had ended an era. Its roar was the sound of modern warfare announcing itself to the world. Clean, swift, and unstoppable. But in its echo lay a haunting silence. The reminder that power, once unbound, can remake the world beyond all intention. Tokyo's skies would one day fill again with aircraft, this time carrying passengers, not bombs. But the memory of those nights, when the horizon glowed red and distance meant nothing, would remain etched into history. The Mustang's shadow still flies there, not in triumph, but as a quiet warning of what happens when technology outpaces mercy.